We're going to turn now to the future Queen consort, Camilla. She's given a rare interview about her life with Prince Charles and how she has learned to cope with criticism after decades in the spotlight. Maggie really is in London with the story. Good morning, Maggie.
Hey, George, good morning. Yeah, we rarely get to hear the Duchess speaking this candidly. She's coming up on her 75th birthday, a time when most people are slowing down. But instead, Camilla's gearing up to take on her biggest role yet. And she says it's now, at age 75, that she knows herself better than ever.
But what happened on that Tuesday night changed something. Not just in the palace. Not just in the headlines. It changed something in the unspoken agreement between the Crown and everyone orbiting it. This wasn't a tabloid rumor. This wasn't an unnamed source whispering through a back channel. This happened live. In front of millions. Under studio lights. At 8 o'clock in the evening, when all of Britain was watching. Britain thought it knew what a royal scandal looked like. It thought it knew the shape of it. The familiar cycle of leaked stories, carefully worded palace statements, a front page or two, and then silence. The monarchy had survived worse. It always did. It bent without breaking. It absorbed the blow and moved on. And the people who did it weren't enemies of the Crown. They weren't journalists with an agenda or foreign critics with a grudge. They were family. They sat at the same Christmas table as the king. They had walked through the same palace doors that most of the world would never see. They had been given something rare and precious, access, protection, proximity to power, and they used it to strike. What Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes said on that broadcast didn't just embarrass the royal family. It drew blood. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. By the time the studio lights went dark, the damage was already done. And somewhere inside Buckingham Palace, a man who had spent decades holding the monarchy together with patience and discipline sat very still in a room that smelled of sandalwood and old books, watching a glowing screen and making a decision that would echo for years. I need you to understand something before we go any further. What you are about to hear is not a story about a family argument that went too far. It is not a story about careless words spoken in the heat of a moment.
Thank you so much for talking to us. This is a slightly peculiar, unusual way of doing an interview. We are living in very unusual times at the moment.
This is a story about arrogance. About the specific kind of arrogance that grows in people who are handed proximity to greatness and mistake it for greatness itself. This is a story about what happens when you forget your place inside the most powerful institution in Britain. And this is a story about what a king does when the threat doesn't come from outside the palace walls. It comes from his own dinner table. Hi viewers, I want to ask you something personal before we go any further. If your own family member publicly humiliated the person you had spent your entire life protecting, would you choose your family, or would you choose to do what was right? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Because that is exactly the impossible choice that was sitting on King Charles's desk that night. And the answer he gave shook the entire nation. Now let me take you back to the moment it all began to fall apart. Tom Parker Bowles had been riding a quiet wave of royal comfort since his mother's coronation in 2023. He was not a senior working royal. He held no official title, carried no formal duty, performed no public service on behalf of the Crown. He was a food critic, a personality.
That is the remarkable thing about this. It always produces the best in everybody in so many ways, and that I think is something which is so special about the reaction. But at the same time, we have to make sure we try to do better in the future.
A man whose most significant professional contributions involved restaurant columns and cookbook launches. And yet somehow, in the months following that coronation, something shifted in how Tom carried himself. The royal cars. The nods from palace staff. The quiet understanding that his last name now came attached to something much larger than a cookbook deal. It changed him. Not all at once. Gradually. The way entitlement always moves. Slowly, then suddenly. His sister Laura Lopes was no different. Poised, well-dressed, and fiercely loyal to her mother, Laura had spent years existing in the comfortable shadow of the royal world without ever being truly part of it. She attended the events. She smiled in the photographs. But beneath that polished exterior, something had been building for a long time. Years of watching Catherine. Years of watching the world project every ideal of grace and dignity onto a woman Laura seemed to believe had simply been lucky enough to marry well. That resentment doesn't disappear just because the cameras are rolling. Sometimes, the cameras are exactly what pulls it to the surface. The broadcast was scheduled as a light evening feature. Charity work. Public engagement. The kind of interview that fills programming gaps and generates polite headlines. The host was warm. The studio was bright. Tom settled into his chair with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. Laura sat beside him, composed, chin slightly raised, the picture of someone who had convinced herself that what she was about to do was not only acceptable, it was necessary. It started calmly. Too calmly. And then the host asked about the future of the royal family. That was the match. Tom leaned back. That smirk settled across his face like he'd been rehearsing it. And then he started talking about Prince William. He called him rigid. Rehearsed. A man performing a role rather than living one. He said William's public duties were hollow. That they showed no real understanding of modern Britain. He said it with the casual confidence of someone who had never once stood in front of a grieving crowd and had to hold the weight of an entire nation's grief on his shoulders. The crew froze. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Because nobody could quite believe what they were hearing. Then Laura leaned forward. She aimed her words at Catherine with the precision of someone who had been storing them for a very long time. She said Catherine's grace was a media illusion. That she was a polished figure with no real political weight behind her. That the image the world had fallen in love with was carefully constructed and carefully maintained and fundamentally empty. The studio held its breath. And then Laura said the thing that crossed every line. She looked directly into the camera. Her voice went quiet and sharp at the same time. And she told the world that it was her mother, Queen Camilla, who had truly held the monarchy together. That Camilla had done it with grace and patience and without the credit she deserved. And then she went further. She said Camilla deserved the crown more than anyone. More than anyone. Every person watching knew what that sentence meant. Every person in that studio knew what had just happened. That wasn't a daughter defending her mother. That was a direct challenge to the line of succession. A public declaration that the wrong woman wore the crown. That William and Catherine's future was somehow less legitimate than the woman sitting beside the king. The cameras kept rolling. They always do. Tom tugged at his silk tie. Laura's eyes carried something that looked almost like triumph. They rose from their seats when the interview ended like two people who believed they had just said something brave. They had no idea they had just signed their own removal from royal life. Outside the studio, the clip detonated. Within 20 minutes it was the top trending topic across every platform in Britain. Newsrooms that had been preparing for a quiet evening scrambled. Phones lit up in offices across London. Editors pulled their front pages. And in living rooms from Cornwall to Edinburgh, people sat forward in their seats and asked each other the same question. Did they really just say that? They did. And somewhere in Buckingham Palace, a golden light burned in a private study, and the man who had spent 30 years stitching the monarchy back together was watching every word of it play back on a small glowing screen. Alone. Silent. And absolutely furious. Not in the way you might expect. Not with noise or heat or the kind of rage that announces itself. This was the other kind. The cold kind. The kind that doesn't rush. The kind that plans. Britain was about to find out exactly what that looked like. The study was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not the quiet of an empty room. The quiet of a room where someone has chosen not to make a sound. Where the decision to stay still is itself a kind of statement. The chandeliers cast their gold light across the portraits lining the walls, kings and queens staring down from their frames, unmoved by everything that had ever happened beneath them. Unmoved by everything happening now.
Man attacked me, and I did fight back, and I got off. I remember getting off the train and my mother looking at me and saying, you know, why is your hair standing on end?
Charles sat behind the mahogany desk with his hands clasped in front of him. The tablet glowed on the surface beside his papers. His private secretary stood near the door, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. Neither of them had spoken in several minutes. The clip played again. He had watched it 4 times already. Each time he told himself he was looking for something he had missed. Some context that would soften it. Some angle that would allow him to frame this as careless rather than calculated. He kept watching because some part of him still hoped that what he had seen was not what it appeared to be. But it was. Every single time, it was exactly what it appeared to be. Tom's voice filled the room from the small speaker. Rigid. Rehearsed. Hollow shows with no real grasp of modern Britain. Each word landing with a flat, clinical precision that made it worse somehow. This wasn't passion. This wasn't someone overcome by emotion who said more than they meant. Tom had leaned back in that chair like a man settling in for something he had been planning. Like a man who had rehearsed his own lines while accusing someone else of doing exactly that. Charles pressed his jaw tight. Then Laura's voice. The grace is a media illusion. A polished figure with no real political weight. And then that final sentence. The one that had stopped the room. The one that was now burning across every screen in Britain. Camilla deserved the crown more than anyone. The tablet went dark. Charles didn't reach to play it again. He sat with it. The way you sit with something that has permanently altered the shape of a room. The way you sit when you understand that the version of things that existed an hour ago no longer exists, and what comes next is entirely up to you. He had been here before. Not here exactly, not this precise combination of betrayal and consequence, but in this general territory. The place where love and duty stop moving in the same direction. Where you have to decide which one you are when it matters most. He thought about the years. The years of careful navigation. The years of shielding Camilla from the weight of public opinion that had never fully warmed to her, of building something steady and dignified from what had once been the most scrutinized relationship in the world. He had fought for that. Quietly, consistently, with the kind of patience that most people never see because it doesn't make headlines. He had brought her family into the circle. Extended the warmth. Made space at the table that was never automatically theirs to sit at. And Tom and Laura had sat at that table. They had taken those seats. Accepted that warmth. And then they had walked into a television studio and used it to publicly undermine the very people that table was built to protect. William. Catherine. His son. His daughter-in-law. The future of everything he had spent his life maintaining. Charles rose from the desk slowly and walked to the tall window. The courtyard below was still. The guards moved in their measured rhythm, unhurried, precise, indifferent to whatever was unraveling inside the palace walls above them. The street lights painted the stone in cold silver. Fog was beginning to settle at the edges of the gate. He pressed one hand to the window frame. There are moments that separate what you feel from what you must do. Most people encounter them rarely. Charles had encountered them more times than he could count. He understood the particular silence that lives inside those moments. The way everything else falls away and what remains is the simple, unavoidable outline of what has to happen next. He was in that silence now. His grip on the window frame tightened. Not in anger. In resolve. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Not uncertain. Not emotional. Just low and very clear, and carrying the full weight of the institution he had given his entire life to. He said that this time it could not be overlooked. Then he walked back to the desk. lifted the palace phone. And when the call connected, he said 4 words that set everything in motion.
I remember something that had been lurking in the back of my brain for a very long time, that when I was a teenager, I was attacked on a train. And I'd sort of forgotten about it, but I remember at the time being so angry. It was anger, and I thought, why is this? Well, it was a sort of boy. I thought it was an old man, was probably not a great deal older than me, but...
For words that his private secretary would later describe to no one as the quietest verdict he had ever witnessed. By the time those 4 words reached their destination, Tom and Laura's world was already changing. They simply hadn't felt it yet. The morning came grey and still over London. Tom Parker Bowles woke in his private villa to a phone that had already begun its slow withdrawal. Messages that would have arrived by now hadn't. Calls from the usual circle. The lunch invitations. The casually dropped notes from people who moved in the right rooms and liked to keep him close. Nothing. A quiet that felt different from ordinary quiet. The kind that tells you something before you're ready to understand it. He told himself it was early. He made coffee. Checked his phone again. Scrolled through the coverage online and felt something close to satisfaction at the scale of it. They were talking about him. About Laura. The clip was everywhere. He read the outrage in the comments with the detachment of someone who had convinced himself that controversy and relevance were the same thing. He thought the noise meant he had mattered. He didn't understand yet that the noise was a funeral procession with his name on it. Laura had spent the morning behind drawn curtains. She had seen enough of the coverage to know the public reaction was not what she had anticipated. The British people's loyalty to Catherine ran deeper than she had calculated. The comments weren't split. They weren't a debate. They were a verdict. And it was unanimous. She told herself it would pass. That in a week something else would dominate the headlines and this would dissolve into the background noise of the royal news cycle the way everything eventually did. She was wrong. The sitting room where Charles received them that morning had been arranged with a specific kind of care. Not cold, not formal in the obvious sense, but carrying an atmosphere that both Tom and Laura registered the moment they stepped through the door. The fireplace crackled. The sofa sat in their usual arrangement. The curtains let in the grey morning light. And yet the room felt like somewhere you were summoned to, not welcomed into. Charles stood with his back to them when they entered. He didn't turn immediately. That pause was not accidental. Everything Charles did in that room, every gesture, every silence, every unhurried movement, was the language of a man who had long since stopped needing to perform authority because he simply had it. Tom adjusted his jacket. His chin carried its familiar tilt. Even here, even now, there was something in his posture that refused to fully surrender the confidence he had walked in wearing. He had his mother's position to fall back on. Or so he believed. Laura's heels were quiet on the carpet. She held her bag with both hands. Not nervously. Defiantly. Charles turned. And the thing that made both of them go still was not anger. It was the absence of it. His eyes were calm. Empty in the specific way that a room is empty after everything valuable has been removed from it. He looked at them with a clarity that had nothing left in it to negotiate with. He spoke first about duty. About the line of succession and what it represented. Not just legally, not just ceremonially, but in the architecture of public trust that the monarchy depended on entirely. He explained, with a patience that was itself a kind of severity, what their words had done to that architecture. Tom's response was a slow smile. Not a smirk exactly. Something more considered than that. He spoke carefully, with the tone of a man who believed he was offering clarity to someone who had misunderstood the situation. He said that what he had said about William was the truth. That the monarchy needed voices willing to say difficult things. That tradition for its own sake was a cage. He said he was trying to help. Charles said nothing. Laura filled the silence. She said that defending her mother was not a crime. that everything she had stated on that broadcast was a reflection of what she believed and what she had witnessed, and that if the truth was uncomfortable, then perhaps the discomfort was worth examining. Her voice was steady. Her eyes did not drop. Neither of them apologized. Not a word of it. Not a suggestion of it. Not even the performance of regret for the sake of the room they were standing in. Charles looked at them for a long moment. The clock on the mantel marked the seconds. The fire made its small sounds. And in that silence, something that had been undecided became decided. He had come into this room with a fraction of hope remaining. A door left barely open on the possibility that they might give him something, anything, some small acknowledgement that would allow him to handle this quietly, within the family, without the full weight of what he now understood he was going to have to do. They had closed that door themselves. When they turned to leave, neither of them bowed. The door shut behind them with a sound that seemed too loud for the room. Charles did not move. He stood and listened to their footsteps fade down the corridor. Then he turned back toward the desk. The gold-tipped pen was exactly where he had left it. The dossier sat beneath the desk lamp with the stillness of something that had been waiting. A single folder. Dark cover. No markings on the outside that would tell you what was inside. But Charles knew. He had reviewed every line of it the night before. He had read it with the same attention he brought to everything that carried permanent consequence. He sat down. The lamp threw its narrow light across the surface. Outside, London moved through its grey morning without any knowledge of what was being decided inside this room. Cars on the street below. A courier on a bicycle cutting through the intersection. Ordinary life continuing at its ordinary pace, oblivious. Charles opened the folder. The decree was precise. Unambiguous. The language of it didn't perform emotion. It didn't explain itself in terms of hurt or disappointment or betrayal. It simply stated, with a clean authority of institutional power, what was being removed and from whom. All privileges associated with royal proximity. All access to events, engagements, and official functions carried out under the banner of the Crown. All protections extended by virtue of their relationship to the Queen Consort. The security arrangements. The invitations. The quiet acknowledgements from palace staff that signaled membership in an inner world. Gone. Every piece of it, dismantled in a single document. Charles held the pen over the final line. His hand was steady. People would later imagine that there was something dramatic in this moment. A trembling. A long hesitation. A tear, perhaps, for what this meant to Camilla. But that is not what happened. What happened was simpler and in many ways more devastating than any of that. He signed his name. The pen moved across the page with the same steady control he brought to every official document he had ever signed. The signature ended with a single firm point of ink. He capped the pen, closed the folder, and sat back in his chair with the particular exhaustion of a man who has just done something irrevocable and knows it. No announcement would be made. That was deliberate. The palace would not issue a statement. There would be no press conference, no formal address, no carefully worded paragraph released to the morning papers. The removal would be communicated through absence. Tom and Laura's names would simply stop appearing on royal schedules. Their access would quietly dissolve. The invitations would stop coming. The doors would stop opening. And the silence would be so complete, so total, that the message it carried would be impossible to misread. That same afternoon, a courier arrived at Tom's London villa. Stone-faced. No small talk. An envelope bearing no return address that any outsider would recognize, but that Tom knew immediately. He took it without a word. Stood in his doorway for a moment after the courier left. Then carried it inside. The letter contained one demand. A public apology. Addressed directly to Prince William and Princess Catherine. Issued within a defined window of time. No private communication would substitute for it. No back-channel conversation would resolve it. The apology had to be public because the humiliation had been public. Refuse, and everything would follow. The same envelope arrived at Laura's home. She set it on her mantelpiece and did not open it. Not that day. Tom spent the afternoon making calls that went unanswered. By evening, the pattern was unmistakable. The network of connections he had quietly relied upon, the people who had returned his calls within the hour for years, had gone still. Not hostile. Not confrontational. Simply unavailable. That specific unavailability that tells you the calculation has already been made and you were on the wrong side of it. He stood at his window as night fell over London. Below, people moved through the streets carrying their ordinary evenings. And Tom Parker Bowles, food critic, son of the Queen Consort, man who had leaned back in a television chair 48 hours ago with a smirk and a borrowed sense of royal invincibility, stood alone in his flat and began, very slowly, to understand the weight of what had happened. Then came the silence that no one had predicted. Not Charles's silence. Not the palace's silence. Camilla's. She did not call Tom. She did not call Laura. She did not send a private message through any of the channels available to her. She did not reach out to soften the blow or promise to intervene or assure them that she was working on it behind the scenes. She walked the corridors of Buckingham Palace in those days with her face set and her eyes forward, and she said nothing about her children to anyone. That was the cruelest part of all of it. Not the decree. Not the vanishing invitations or the unanswered calls or the public appetite for their humiliation. The cruelest part was that their own mother, the woman whose name they had used, whose crown they had leveraged, whose honor they had claimed to be defending, had chosen the throne over them. She had done the calculation and arrived at the only answer that would allow her to remain where she was. And she had accepted that answer. Tom and Laura had gone on television to tell the world their mother deserved everything. What they discovered, in the silence that followed, was that everything had a price. And Camilla had already decided what she was and was not willing to pay. Winter moved into the palace slowly and without announcement. The fog that had been sitting at the gates thickened. The stone of the courtyard held its cold. Inside those long corridors, the name Parker Bowles grew quieter by the week. Not erased dramatically. Just allowed to fade. The way things fade when no one is maintaining them. Camilla continued her duties. She appeared beside Charles at the engagements that required her presence. She smiled at the right moments and held her composure with the practiced ease of someone who had survived far worse public scrutiny than this. She never spoke publicly about Tom or Laura. She never acknowledged the situation in any forum where her words could be recorded. She had drawn a boundary around herself and she maintained it without visible effort. But there were people close to the palace who would later say that she seemed different. That something in her had gone quiet in a way that hadn't been there before. Not broken. Just recalibrated. As though she had made a trade she understood the full cost of and had accepted the cost and moved forward regardless. Tom's London villa grew quieter with each passing week. He stopped checking his phone with the same urgency. The calls had stopped coming and he had stopped expecting them. He sat in his library on certain evenings with the lights turned low, looking at old photographs. Himself at royal events. Himself beside the family at Sandringham. The version of his life that had seemed permanent and turned out to have been entirely conditional. The arrogance had burned through itself. What was left underneath was something he wasn't sure he had a name for yet. Laura never opened the letter. The apology demand sat on her mantelpiece through those weeks like a challenge she could not bring herself to accept and could not afford to refuse. The pride that had carried her into that television studio and kept her chin raised through the confrontation with Charles had not fully left her. But it had changed shape. It no longer felt like strength. It felt like the last thing she had left. Charles stood on the balcony one evening as the city settled into its winter dark. The cold pressed against his face. Below him, the courtyard moved in its disciplined rhythm. The guards. The lights. The iron geometry of a place that had existed for centuries before him and would exist for centuries after. He didn't look like a man who had won something. He looked like a man who had done what was required of him and was living with what that cost. There is a difference. Most people never learn to tell them apart. Charles had learned it a long time ago. At the far end of the East Corridor, William and Catherine walked with their children. Laughter drifted through the heavy air, light and unguarded, the specific sound of people who feel safe. Charles heard it from the balcony. He turned his head slightly in the direction of it. And something in his face, just for a moment, shifted into something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. The storm had passed. The lesson it left behind would not. The monarchy had not raised its voice, had not held a press conference or issued a rebuke or invited the public into its deliberations. It had simply closed a door and left the silence where the welcome used to be. And that silence, more than any statement, more than any headline, had communicated everything that needed to be said. Tom and Laura had walked into that television studio believing that proximity to power was the same as power. They had discovered, the hard way, that it never is. Power is not inherited through a step-parent's title. It is not borrowed from a mother's crown. It does not transfer through dinner invitations or royal car rides or the quiet nods of palace staff who are simply doing their jobs. It resides in the institution. And the institution decides who belongs to it. Here is what no one is talking about yet. What happened to Tom and Laura was not the end of this story. It was a warning shot. And inside the palace, there are others watching. Others who have been given proximity and have begun, in recent months, to mistake it for something more. Others who have grown comfortable at a table they did not build and do not maintain. Charles drew a line with his own wife's children. His own family. The people closest to him on earth outside of his direct bloodline. He drew that line without hesitation and without public theatre, and he enforced it in the most complete way available to him. So ask yourself this. If the next test of that line comes from someone further from the center, someone with less claim to leniency, someone who makes the mistake Tom and Laura made but with higher stakes and a larger audience, what does that response look like? That answer is already forming. Behind those palace walls. In quiet rooms that smell of sandalwood and old books. At a desk where a gold-tipped pen sits waiting. Stay with me. Because what is coming next inside that palace will make what happened to Tom and Laura look like a rehearsal. And there is one specific detail, one move that is already in motion, that changes everything we think we know about who holds the real power in that family. You cannot afford to miss it.